I begin only because I am older than Slavoj. And it's also why I have the best chair. So all that is perfectly good. I name anti-philosophy. Any system of thought, any thinking, if you want, that opposes the singularity of its act to the philosophical category of truth. So anti-philosophy is that sort of thinking which lies on the contradiction between philosophical discourse on one side and activity or creative act of life on the other side. We can also say that an anti-philosopher uses some features of his or her personal life against the universal abstraction of the philosophical discourse. We know three great classical anti-philosophers. Pascal, against Descartes. Rousseau, against Voltaire and Hume. And Kierkegaard, against Hegel. And we know also three great modern anti-philosophers who are against the entire philosophical tradition. Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, and maybe Lacan. All that is clear for Nietzsche, the most important modern thinker, in fact, for a large part of the philosophy during the last century. For Deleuze, Foucault, Heidegger, and many others, Nietzsche is something like the horizon. We find in Nietzsche the paradigmatic relationship between the act and the destitution of truth. In The Crepuscule of Idols, Nietzsche describes his work in these terms. I quote, "We have abolished the world as truth. This abolition of truth is the negative condition for the Dionysian affirmation." And to explain this affirmation, Nietzsche engages his proper existence as an historical act, a decisive rupture. Nietzsche, in fact, the life of Nietzsche, the proper name of Nietzsche, Nietzsche as a living body, is a fundamental argument for Nietzsche himself, for the affirmation against the philosophical tradition. I quote, I am, Nietzsche, who speaks. I am something more than the leading philosopher of our time. I am something decisive and fatal that springs up between two millenaries. A beautiful declaration. Here we have the pure form of anti-philosophy, an act of a violent subjective nature destroys the philosophical tradition which encloses the life with the word truth. The anti-philosophy, with the radical potency of its act, opposes to the philosophical discourse a simple point, a living point, which is a real point. And it is why the victory of anti-philosophy is a certainty, because it's the victory of the real against the dead form of philosophical rhetoric. The discourse of the real, which is realized in a decisive act, cannot disappear. Lacan himself writes, "It is not I who will win out, it's the discourse that I serve." But this discourse is the discourse of analysts, where the crucial point is the epiphanic apparition and disparition of the real of a subject. So the victory of psychoanalysis is the victory of the real itself. For Nietzsche or Wittgenstein, this victory is at price of a complete destitution of the philosophical category of truth. Not that the anti-philosophical purpose is to discredit truth, not to refute it. And anti-philosophy is not a critique, but a therapeutics. Man must be cured of the philosophic illness. For Wittgenstein, philosophical truth is linked to the nonsense, and so it is harmful. For Wittgenstein, the victory of the real as an act, finally, of aesthetic nature, realizes the complete elimination of metaphysical nonsense. For Lacan, the problem is more complex. Lacan does not destroy the category of truth. Truth is a word of the Lacanian syntax. Lacan refounded the category of truth. And in this foundation, we find both the destitution of the philosophical category of truth and the necessity to cross through it and get out of it. A long and tortuous coquetry with the category of truth. I will attempt briefly that from 1970, a slow movement does proceed in Lacan towards the destitution of truth and its dismissal. This is articulated to two statements in 1973 in the Séminaire 20. May 15, 1973, I quote, "There is some rapport of being that cannot be known." There is something of the real that cannot be known. And March 20, the same year, I quote, what is specific to analysis is that it can constitute for itself knowledge concerning the truth. What is specific to psychoanalysis is constitutes for itself knowledge concerning the truth. These statements, which are related, are about truth, precisely. And the tension is this. On the one hand, truth is supreme as unknown. The truth of the subject produces for the subject itself no knowledge of this truth. It is why truth is unconscious. On one side, but in the hand, on the other hand, the aim of analysis is to generate knowledge about the unknown. So the paradoxical position of Lacan concerning truth is that there is no knowledge of truth, but finally there is a psychoanalytic knowledge concerning this absence of knowledge. That is the great paradox of the unconscious. The key of this enigma, because it is an enigma, has for Lacan a name, a strange name, a Greek name, which is the mateme. What is a mateme? To understand this name, we must return to the act, to the fundamental analytic act. For Lacan, a subject can have an experience of its proper real only in the form of an act. There is, if you want, no abstract knowledge of the real. The real is a revelation in the form of an act. And this act is like a cut in language and also a cut in the ordinary representation of the world, representation which is imaginary. So the act suddenly isolates the real from its normal connection to imaginary and to symbolic order. It's very important, this point. The act, generally speaking, is not only in the field of psychoanalytic cure. The very essence of the act is to separate the real from symbolic context and imaginary context. It is when something of the real is pure, and you face the real not in the mediation of symbolic presentation or imaginary representation, but directly. You face the real. But when you face the real, all is in the form of an act, and not in the form of a knowledge or in the form of an abstract language. It's why that sort of presentation, sudden presentation of the real, it is why the real appears always not as a continuity, but as a point. The real of a subject is always a point of a real point. So we have the question, finally, in all that, where is the knowledge? And where is the truth of the knowledge, or the knowledge of the unknown, to speak as Lacan? Is there a knowledge of the result of this sudden apparition of a real point? Is there somewhere a connection between knowledge, generally speaking, and the real point? Or have we a sort of mystique of the real, which is an experience, but without any knowledge? The answer of Lacan is that there can exist a knowledge of the real, in some sense, at the price of a rigorous formalization. Because formalization, by the strict use of some letters, reproduces the operation of the real and the separation of the real from its common imaginary presentation. With formalization, with small letters, without any imaginary context, we can touch the experience of the real, and we can have a transmission of that sort of experience. And that is precisely a matheme. A matheme is the formalization of a local form of apparition of a real point. It is why Lacan affirms that, I thought, mathematical formalization is our goal, our ideal. It's the ideal of a complete transmission of something real. This ideal is finally linked not to truth, but to knowledge. A matheme is a form of transmission of a knowledge of the real and not of a truth. The anti-philosophic movement of Lacan during the 70s is to go from truth, which is clearly a category of the first Lacan, to go from truth to knowledge concerning the truth, and finally to knowledge alone. And it is the goodbye to philosophy, from truth to knowledge concerning truth, and finally to knowledge alone. And we can say something like that. Philosophy, from the very beginning, affirms the existence of a truth of the real. It's the goal of philosophy. Find something which we can name a truth concerning the real. But Lacan affirms that there is a knowledge of truth as, in fact, by the matheme, a knowledge of the act, a transmission of the act by which a subject faces the real. But that sort of experience, the subject faces the real, can be transmitted in the form of the matheme, not as a truth, but as a knowledge. It's why, at the moment of the foundation of the Freudian school, in 1970, Lacan says, I quote, "Truth can not convince, knowledge becomes act." A strange and very dense formula, but clear in its effect. Truth cannot convince, because we don't know if a truth touches the real. But knowledge becomes act. Knowledge can have certain relationship to the real by the mediation of the matim of an act. And so it's neither a philosophical position nor a mystical position. That is the point. It's not a philosophical position because there is not, for Lacan, a truth concerning the real, but it's not a mystical position because the experience of the real can be transmitted, and can be transmitted by the means of formalization. You know. And so the way of Lacan concerning this point, which is an anti-philosophical way, is also an anti-mystical way. It's not the choice between faith and rational knowledge. There is a way which, for Lacan, is a rational way, which is not reducible to philosophy, but which is not reducible to religious faith or mystic experience. We can say, in other words, that philosophic supposition is that there is such a thing as a love of truth. There is truth concerning the real, and we have love for that sort of experience of truth. But in addition, think Lacan, philosophy says that there must be a love of the truth. You must love the truth. That is, for Lacan, the philosophic imperative. But what is loved in the love of truth if there is no really truth of the real? What is this strange philosophical imperative, love the truth, if the truth is not touching the real? And the answer of Lacan is a very complex and singular one. Because the question of the love of truth can be posed for Lacan. Only is this love, that sort of love, is a love of weakness. The love of truth is the love of this weakness, I quote Lacan, is the love of this weakness that we have lifted the veil off from what is hidden by the truth, and that is called castration. Explanation: truth, in its philosophical sense, is not at all, for Lacan, as for Heidegger, for example, like for Heidegger, for example, the unveiled, the revelation of the real, the point where being is touched. It's much more truth in its philosophical sense, the veil itself, the dissimulation, the fundamental dissimulation of something. The veil which hides a very essential fact, the fact that castration, loss, imperfection, all the forms of weakness and impotency are radical conditions to human existence and for human knowledge. In the philosophical form, the love of truth is the dissimulation of a love for impotence and weakness. The love of what does not say everything, the love of what is impotent to say everything. For the analyst, it's useless to love the truth. However, it is necessary to love knowledge and to desire the matim. The love of truth, says Lacan, is at the center of philosophy, but it pretends to love the truth as power and not as impotency or weakness. And the philosophical illusion resides in that, to say that the love of truth is the origin of a new power of knowledge and finally of human existence. The philosophic patient wants to promote a love of truth as power, and that is necessarily a complete failure. The veritable anti-philosophic thesis of Lacan is, if we pretend to love the truth as power, if we occult the fact that any love of truth is love of a weakness, then we will be impotent with respect to knowledge. We will be exposed to the passion of ignorance. And so you see, at this point, the vision of philosophy by Lacan is a vision of an attempt of a love of truth, which is exposed, in fact, as the passion of ignorance. And so the road, the philosophical road to the truth, finally, is a weakness in face of the question of knowledge. In terms of subjectivity, to place a limit to the passion of ignorance in terms of truth, it is absolutely necessary to love in the truth a weakness. The force of the love of truth is being that of the love of a weakness, and that is, finally, the limited love of knowledge. Philosophy is then a precarious disposition with regard to the passion of ignorance. You know, finally, everything in this vision depends on the triplet knowledge, truth, real. That is where the psychoanalytic act justified Lacan's saying, rise up in arms against philosophy. It's because at the end of his career, he was thinking that philosophy is a sophisticated form of ignorance. I stop here, and I stay under the accusation.
Difficult to follow. I hope you hear me. Glad to be here. Glad to be with Alain. Of course, in this 20 minutes forum, it's just a little bit too little time to really develop a line of thought. All one can do is more just trace, define positions, oppositions, and so on. I would nonetheless like to begin with reference to what is going on recently in your territory, or just off your territory in Louisiana, because I think it concerns precisely in a way, very oblique way, what Alain was talking about this gap, distance between the real and the symbolic, I was thinking about, do you know how Freud's Freudian dream of Irma's injection is structured? First, you have this look deep into Irma's throat, the primal horror, distorted flesh. Then you have this sudden passage from the real into the ridiculous impotence of the symbolic, the three doctors exchanging faked arguments. Isn't this going on now in the United States public discourse? The look into the Irma's throat would have been those camera shots that we get of the oil gushing out, and then the three doctors literally exist, you remember, in the congressional hearing, as the three representatives who were exactly in the same comical way putting the blame of each other. You know, BP representative or CEO even said, no, it's not me, it's the subcontractor. That Halliburton or whatever, I think it's the big Dick Cheney's company, said, no, we just made the plan, it's our own subcontractor who poured the concrete, who screwed it up. And finally, the last one returned the ball and said, no, but we were just following the plans we got from the other two, and so on. So it's clearly this same constellation, but things are more tragic here. Remember when, I think, unfortunately, even President Obama appeared a little bit of a clown here for me when he pathetically claimed, I will make on behalf of American people, whatever, BP, British Petroleum, pay every cent of the damage and so on and so on. Sorry, this is ridiculous. If the spilling will go on the way it goes, even if so many environment ruined, lives ruined, etc., you simply cannot pay for it. It's ridiculous. It's a little bit, I exaggerate consciously, like to say Germany will pay every cent for the Holocaust and so on. I mean, when catastrophes are too big, it's meaningless to talk in these terms. So we have to rethink it. I remember, here I connected to impossibility of sexual relationship. I remember some 20 years ago, exactly in the same territory, the waters, sea waters south of Louisiana, Ted Kennedy, at that point senator, was caught by a paparazzo in a lone boat. He thought he is alone, only sea around, making love to a lady. I mean, it's a blurred image, but very clear. Her legs spread and so on. Exactly at that point, in the Senate, they were debating offshore drilling. And I laughed how a Republican senator, here I liked it, referring to this said, oh, I noticed that recently Senator Kennedy, who was opposed to it, changed his position on offshore drilling. Well, I'm here for Kennedy, no? I think that the only offshore drilling that should be allowed is the one that Kennedy was involved in, no? Okay, but not too much of this. Lacan and anti-philosophy. You know, I will just try to, again, state my case and not just mark some differences, allowing, hopefully, Alain to strike back. Because as I already developed once in Paris, I think, or London, our relationship is that of a master and the hysteric. He's the master, I'm the hysteric, provoking all the time and so on. It's sometimes difficult to provoke the master. Now, more seriously, I was deeply influenced by his insight into the whole concept of anti-philosophy. Maybe I would just shift a little bit or displace, expand, whatever, my understanding of it. Of course, I totally agree with Kim. We can say already Pascal and so on. But nonetheless, Pascal clearly situated himself outside philosophy. For me, maybe I'm wrong. Where do we have the first breakthrough of anti-philosophy as a philosophical position? Maybe, risky hypothesis, Kantian ethics. It's the first time that you clearly have this position of we have the domain of knowledge or theoretical truth, and then we have access to the real through the ethical act, which is, again, the relationship to the impossible real of thinking itself outside truth. It's also interesting how, speaking about anti-philosophy, did you notice that in the history of philosophy, from that point on of Kantian revolution, practically, not totally, of course, entire philosophy no longer wants to be called philosophy. Kant, it's no longer metaphysics, but transcendental critique of the conditions of metaphysics. Fichte is Wissenschaftslehre. That is to say, teaching on science, not philosophy. Schelling privileges art. Hegel also said, no longer love of wisdom, but wisdom itself, not to mention Marx, and so on and so on. So my first constatation when Lacan says, je m'insurge contre la philosophie, is, well, welcome to the camp of philosophers. All philosophers from Kant onwards are doing nothing but that, insurging against philosophy. Nobody wants to be a philosopher. And
except me, except me.
Ah, I agree with you. That's my point. Yeah, that's precisely my point. Because would you agree? Now I have a new proposal for you to try to convert you to my cause of the love of German idealism. You know your four domains, okay, conditions, whatever, of where a truth event can occur. Let's enumerate them. Science, politics, art, love. And I deeply agree with Adrian Johnston's reading of you, where he emphasized an aspect of this which is usually ignored, that this people usually just emphasize your opposite point, which is desuture, not totally attach philosophy to one truth condition. But I think, on the other hand, you make a much nicer point, which is even close to some kind of engaged Marxist thinking, which is nonetheless that philosophy cannot stand it on its own. Heroically, you have to attach yourself to a condition. You cannot be philosopher just in the air. And would you agree or not, this came to me, that the same goes for conditions of truth, goes for German idealism. Look, Kant's problem was science, was how to philosophize in the conditions of Newtonian science. Fichte is clearly politics, French Revolution. Schelling is art, and I claim Hegel is love. We have precisely the four guys there. But okay, now let me go on into anti-philosophy. Where do I maybe shift the accent a little bit? For me, I would say that the great breakthrough of anti-philosophy occurs with the so-called anti-Hegelian turn, in its three main forms. First, the late Schelling and the young Schopenhauer, then Kierkegaard, then Marx. I think that all three, in a way, meet your condition. Philosophy is, in all three versions, denounced as caught in its own circle of representation, abstract contextual thinking, and some kind of return to, not the real in the Lacanian sense, but some kind of a positive singular life foundation. which implies a critique of philosophy, is enacted. For Kierkegaard, this is the unique existence of religious individual which escapes philosophical conceptual mediation. For late Schelling, Heidegger is the primordial, irrational, prelogical abyss of willing outside philosophical truth. And for Marx is the actual life process of actual people, and so on, and so on, and so on. So what I claim is that in all this here, things probably will become, I'm asking you a question, and not in this boring pseudo-pedagogical way where asking someone a question means that you already know what is the truth and just expect from you to confirm. It's really an open question. I claim that what unites all the three, and this is really what happened after Hegel, is that with all violence, a certain opposition became predominant, which I think maybe, I wonder if you would agree, defines the very coordinates for me of anti-philosophy. The opposition between productive presence and mere conceptual, idealistic theater scene of representation. Marx is here very brutal. Marx, the worst Marx, which I think should be abandoned. The Marx of German ideology, with all that stuff of philosophy is with regard to real life, like masturbation is with regard to sexual act, and so on. So again, this idea that we are caught into a closed circle of representation, philosophy, ideology is caught into it, and the point is to break out of this closed circle of representation into some more direct, productive presence. And as my colleague Alain developed in a very nice way, it's interesting how this same topic of denouncing representation became also actual throughout the 19th century. Of course, it was present before, but then it exploded as general problematizing of representation. For example, in the domain of love, all of a sudden the problem was, can love encounter be properly represented in the institution of marriage, with usual ambiguity. On the one hand, it was the bourgeois principle, you know, the only legitimate marriage is marriage which should be founded in love. But then you always have this idea, but nonetheless the institution of marriage cannot fully recuperate love. There is an excess. This idea of an excess escaping representation. You have the same in politics. You have parliamentary representation, but then, you know, this topic of can parliamentary representation adequately represent social base? Isn't there something in social base which escapes representation? The first one to fully develop this was already none other than Hegel in his wonderfully ambiguous notion of Pöbel, rebel. Rebel as the non-representable element. Now, here I'm just asking you a question and trying to draw maybe a line of distinction. I think this entire topic of productive presence and then misrepresented in some scene of representation should be ultimately dropped. This is for me the core of anti-philosophy. And now comes the evil part. I don't have time to develop it. The Stalinist part of me. I think you remain here, for my taste, sometimes a little bit of too much of anti-philosopher. Sometimes you also mobilize this representation versus the real of productive presence with this topic. So this is, again, my first point. And it would be very interesting here to play, in a nice way, different philosophers one against the other. For example, although we both totally, more or less, disagree with Derrida, I think that when Derrida, I wonder if you agree, is at his best, it's when he, not in his critique of metaphysics, we know that, but in his critique of too fast, direct, anti-philosophical attempts to break out. The Derrida I love is Derrida reading Foucault, Bataille, Levinas, where he takes someone who tries to enact the basic anti-philosophical gesture, like Bataille against Hegelian philosophy, sovereignty, Foucault against Cartesian cogito, madness, as anti-philosophy point outside, or Levinas against philosophical totality, infinity of relating to otherness. And I think here Derrida is a good anti-philosopher. In a wonderful, detailed analysis, he shows how all these attempts to break out remain nonetheless in a hidden way determined by the field they want to undermine. So here, again, we can learn something. We can learn something from Derrida. You know, Derrida is not just the one who wants to screw philosophy, break out of it, and so on and so on. He is a good philosopher, especially good in showing how it's not as easy as it may appear to break out of philosophy. Especially actual today, I think, is, for example, Derrida's, and later developed by others, critique of Levinas. Because I think that if there is one of the great books of anti-philosophy, it's Levinas's Totality and Infinity. And I think it is easy to show how Levinas's critique of Hegel, and especially of Heidegger, which was later taken over by Jean-Luc Marion, this idea that even Heidegger remains too much within philosophy, that even the ontological difference between being and entities still remains within the horizon of being, while we must break through towards this infinite radical otherness of God beyond being. I think it can be shown in a convincing way, every serious philosopher can show it, that Levinas simply doesn't hold there. That the price is a very superficial reduction of the notion of being to some pretty naive, positive reality, and then you can say, oh, but God is outside it, and so on and so on. A Heideggerian who would have insisted here that even if God outside beyond being still has to, of course, not exist as a determinate object, but has to be present, disclose itself in a certain way, would be fully justified. You cannot escape it as simple as that. So, again, I don't have time to develop it, but the reason I remain faithful to Hegel would have been that I insist that Hegel is absolutely unique here. He is on the, usually people perceive Hegel in this shift from traditional metaphysics, philosophy to anti-philosophy in the guise of the 19th century historicism, life philosophy, and so on, as somewhere in between. As they say, on the one hand, Hegel remained absolute metaphysician, system, everything. On the other hand, we already find in Hegel good historical analysis, and so on and so on. I think this image of Hegel is deeply misleading, like a little bit here, a little bit there. I think he was not a little bit here, a little bit there. He was neither here nor there. He was a unique point, no longer philosopher in the sense of metaphysical philosopher, but not yet anti-philosopher. That's what makes Hegel so traumatic. So now let me go on into just two more points. First, I'll try to be as brief as possible, into how I locate Lacan's anti-philosophy. Basically, I am totally in full agreement with Alain. Maybe I would just formulate the ambiguity of Lacan in a little bit different way. For me, first one has to be precise in where does Lacan locate that anti-philosophical point, if you would have put it, on behalf of which Lacan makes this pathetic claim. Je m'insurge, I raise myself contre la philosophie, against philosophy. This point is clearly jouissance, the excess of enjoyment. For Lacan, this excess of, for Lacan, let me be very precise. Philosophy is that which begins with Parmenides, you know, the same is being and logos, thinking, talking, this kind of a pre-established harmony between discourse and being. Being can be logically apprehended, set. For Lacan, again, as you pointed out, this is the anti-philosophical core of Lacan. There is something which introduces a crack here. Here is a nice quote from Lacan of 1966, his seminar on the object of psychoanalysis. Quote, I challenge whichever philosopher to account now for the relation that is between the emergence of the signifier and the way jouissance relates to being. No philosophy, I say, meets us here today. The wretched, aborted freaks of philosophy, which we drag behind us from the beginning of the last, means 19th century, as the habits that are falling apart, are nothing but a way to frisk rather than to confront this question, which is the only question about truth and which is called and named by Freud the death drive, the primordial masochism of jouissance. All philosophical speech escapes and withdraws here. Now, I will try here to be at the same time critical but also positive towards Lacan. First, I would say what always fascinated me in Lacan is what did he, one enigma which an ex-colleague of Alain, François Balmes, in his very good studies on Lacan emphasized, the great mystery and perhaps the best way to approach Lacan is to ask a very simple, almost detective question. Lacan obviously knew Heidegger very well. Why then did he stick to the notion of the subject? Why didn't he drop subject? I mean, as the name for the core of, inhuman core of human being. I think the reason is, and here again, from a weird perspective, I approach one of the big topics of Alain, where I agree with him, the relationship between language and truth. Where I support Alain fully is in his, the way I understand it, anti-hermeneutic trust of not identifying truth with. The one who developed this most radically was Heidegger, arguably. This idea that truth is ultimately the historically destined horizon of being which dwells, is inscribed into our language. And in this historicized transcendental mode, a Heideggerian would have said, this is the unsurpassable horizon of our access to truth. The ultimate, the furthest you can go is to reflect on the horizon of how things appear to you, of how being is disclosed. For example, you can make, I don't know how many speculative quantum physics discoveries, but in order to pursue them, you already have to have a certain historically destined, embodied in language, pre-understanding of being. So all we can do then is to think the event, not in Alain's sense, but as Heideggerian Ereignis, of new destinies of being. This totally abyssal game of eventual occurrences of modes of disclosure is the ultimate horizon. So in this sense, for Heidegger, language is the house of being. What Lacan does here, basically, I think, is just to add something, a dimension missing in what Lacan does here, missing in Heidegger. To put it in cynical terms, for Lacan, language is not just the house of being, it's a torture house of being. We are basically tortured by language. That's all the topic of castration, distortion, and so on. We are never at home in the house of being. It's a traumatic discord. And again, the name of this discord is jouissance. And so here I come to Alain. I don't like Elfriede Jelinek. Her style is too dirty for me. But she said something that I deeply agree with, a wonderful phrase. She said, language should be tortured to tell the truth. I think that this would be the second counterpart, that we should drop all this hermeneutic trust into, you know, the access to truth is open yourself to the message which is in language. No, we should torture language. And I think maybe we should even read poetry and art in this way, as different modes of torture. What is poetry? It's a great torture of language. Imagine how you have to torture language to write a simple sonnet form. Cut words, squeeze them, and so on. Even in cinema as art, what was Eisenstein doing? My God, all his works are already works of extreme violence and torture. Cut, montage, stitch it together, and so on. Now you will say, yeah, this is Eisenstein's manipulative approach. What about the great opposition to Eisenstein? André Bazin, Rossellini, Arthur Tarkovsky, where you have the passive attitude of just filming, not intervening. Well, I would say it's a different mode of torture. It's slow it down. How do you call that instrument where somebody is tortured so that you tie him up and then stretch it? Yeah, that's Tarkovsky. So I would say, imagine a debate between Eisenstein and Tarkovsky. It's like two torturers. What's the better way to squeeze out the truth? And I agree with Alain. I think that of course, we think in language, but nonetheless, paradoxically, language is not our horizon. Language in its, let's call it naively, mytho-poetic function. Language, as you know, poetry in the bad sense of poetry as founding a nation and so on. I think that we can do more. Truly great artists, poets do more. They torture their language. They force it to go beyond. We can, within language, think with language, against language, to arrive at a true universality. This is a very radical thesis, but I think it's crucial. And I'm not sure Lacan himself is clear here. If he were to be clear at this point, he is ambiguous, he would no longer be anti-philosopher. But I think this is the crucial point. Again, is the historicist transcendental attitude, language is our fate, the last thing we do, is this the last thing, or can we break out of the, to use Frederick Glenson's term, the prison house of language and formulate universality outside it? Now, a step further. I claim that this is why, as Balmes demonstrates, Lacan stick to the notion of subject. Subject for Lacan, as you pointed out when you emphasize this weakness, and so on. Subject for Lacan is not in this modern way the excess of this Cartesian subject, not in Descartes' sense, but more in this Heideggerian sense of modern subjectivity, dominate the world, mediate it, technologically master it, and so on. Subject is the one who, as Lacan puts it, who suffers from the symbolic. It's tortured. And to designate this, Lacan, this dimension of being tortured by language is missing in Heidegger, which is why I'm so sad I don't have time to develop this, why I think Lacan emphasizes a feature of Antigone, which is totally absent in Heidegger. In his two great readings of Antigone, Heidegger never mentions this famous position in between the two deaths. That is to say, you are still biologically alive, exclude from, because this is the pure position of what Agamben later calls homo sacer, of subject as tortured. And I'm even tempted to say, to make a quick, far-fetched reference to fashionable one, fashionable in accusations against Heidegger, to concentration camps and so on. You know where you can see that Heidegger misses this dimension? You know that famous passage from Heidegger, which horrified many people, where he says that in concentration camps, they were just in an industrial way producing corpses. People were not really dying there. Well, of course, this is true in a way, but I would say it is true for the executioners. If you were somebody dying in Auschwitz, you didn't feel, oh my God, I'm just an object being technologically produced, no? Precisely this other side is missing here. Now we can go on. Because of all this, of this dimension missing, I agree with what you developed as Lacan, from truth to knowledge about truth to knowledge. I would only say that maybe desperately there is an alternate way to read this as not anti-philosophical. In what sense? You know that strictly parallel to the movement that you described in these precise terms is, and this is very nicely, incidentally, I love this naivety of Balmes, who makes a brutal clinical judgment on Heidegger. I love it. It appears brutal nonsense, but where he says that the problem with Heidegger's description of, for example, Dasein being there in Sein und Zeit is that it's good for neurotics, but it doesn't cover psychotics. You know in what naive sense he was right? Let's take what Catherine Malabou calls post-traumatic subject, or this, homo sacer and so on. They describe a subjective position of this suffering, being tortured by language and so on, which I think, you know how Heidegger describes being human in time and being, as this from future through the past to present, engaged existence and so on. You are out of that. You are no longer caught into this structure of care, engaged existence, but nonetheless you are not outside animal. You are still human, being deprived of it. This would be vaguely the psychotic position. For this, there is no place in Heidegger. So I find this a very nice thesis of how, again, Lacan sticks to the notion of subject, not because he remains modern age, faithful to modern age subjectivity, which is the cause of our crisis. He does, but for the opposite reason. And now I want just to supplement you. Balmes shows in a triumphant way here how this movement from truth, knowledge of truth, knowledge is strictly correlative in Lacan to the forceful reaffirmation of the Cartesian cogito. When you have this late Lacan's knowledge, always you should think cogito. Here, you should always bear in mind that when we think about Lacan et cogito, it's not enough to recite those boring old poems, you know, of Lacan said against Descartes, I am not where I think. This can still be read in a purely anti-philosophical way. It simply means the truth of my being, the true lively productivity is not where I think. Then Lacan turns it around and says, I think where I am not. This is more interesting, where the unconscious is not the fullness of my being outside my thought, but it's a pure thinking outside myself, not where I feel myself existentially as the one I am. Then there are other formulations, but as Balmes points out very nicely, what Lacan does in his seminar, I think on Logique du fantasme, logic of fantasy, is to return to the identity of cogito and being, but as an empty set. For the last Lacan, cogito, in cogito, being and thinking do coincide, but in a negative way. In cogito, I'm pure thinking, but which is just a form of thinking, without any content. At the same time, I'm pure being, but deprived of any content. It's just as if the two empty points overlap here. And again, as such, this cogito should be asserted as universal, non-historical. Non-historical. Historicity is, I think, not the ultimate horizon. Which is why, as I try to develop in one of my texts, I think that one can, in a very nice way, refer here to Walter Benjamin. You know, when he talks about these two types of violence, staatsbildend and staatszerstörend. Violence which creates state, and violence which, this divine violence. And I think that Heidegger's problem is that when he does talk about violence and language, his notion of language as poets who grounds a polis, a nation, is still staatsbildend. I would like, in parallel to the relation of violence and state, to assert also not violence immanent in this imposing a certain disclosure of being, what poets do for a nation, but sprachzerstörend violence. Violence of torturing language breaking through to universality. So here, I think that maybe partially things, I haven't yet thought them to the end. Things are here very ambiguous for me, but I would have said nonetheless that here maybe Lacan's anti-philosophy can nonetheless be maybe reinterpreted as precisely, because you know when Lacan says anti-philosophy, one should always ask the obvious question, what is philosophy for him? And the quote that I read you is very ambiguous here. Lacan qualifies philosophy, to which he opposes, as wretched aborted freaks of philosophy, which we drag behind us from the beginning of the 19th century. That is to say, basically anti-philosophy. He designated philosophy this post-Hegelian philosophy. So again, what I would have said is that one should never forget that for Lacan, philosophy is rather this hermeneutic harmony between being and thinking, which is historically specified, and so on and so on. I think that through the link of cogito and knowledge and so on, one can maybe construct an out-reading Lacan against Lacan of totally crazy, like we want to do, a kind of a return to pure cogito, matem, knowledge, and so on, outside this historicist hermeneutic, universal. But one crucial problem here. What about jouissance as nameless and so on? Doesn't Lacan nonetheless sustain his critique of philosophy in this disturbing element of excess of jouissance? Many things can be said here. I think one can even answer here in a very nice way Quentin Meillassoux when he insisted on the problem of fossil as that third element which breaks this transcendental correlation. I think that for Lacan, you don't have to go outside. The true fossil is object small a. It's here in me, not Lacan. For Lacan, Meillassoux would have been way too Leninist in the bad sense of materialism and empiriocriticism. Meillassoux, for me, remains all too stuck in this typical naive pre-Hegelian problematic of we are caught in our representations. Can we reach out of them to reality in itself or not? For me as a Hegelian, this is a pseudo problem. The problem is not can we reach the in itself. The problem is Badiou's problem. How can in this stupid real something like thought emerge? The true problem is not can we go beyond our appearances to the real in itself. The problem is the one approached by Badiou in his Logics of the World. How can in the flat stupidity of the real something like the word emerge? Hegel knew this very clearly. The problem is not break out of appearance. The problem is how is appearance possible? Okay, but to go on. So, jouissance. Here, I wonder if you would accept something. In one of your texts, you were totally right to characterize Lacan's reference to jouissance féminine as a reference to some kind of a cultural unsayable. But I don't think it is necessary to read it in that way, although I admit this is a predominant way. You know, in Lacan's formula of sexuation, when Lacan, how does Lacan describe this feminine position of jouissance? Usually this is read as something in woman resist symbolic order. Not all of woman is caught into the symbolic order. But I think if we read this in the sense of there is something in woman, this excess of mystical, enraptured jouissance which resists the symbolic, maybe we don't read Lacan correctly. Maybe we should nonetheless emphasize how the non-all of feminine jouissance also means that there is no exception. We should also say there is nothing in woman which is outside the symbolic order or whatever. So I think that instead of reading jouissance féminine as kind of a mystical enrapture and so on, we should, so that, to put it bluntly in an almost sexist way, we men are purely within the symbolic order, women are with one leg in, with another part of them it resists with some kind of enrapture. I think women are paradoxically more fully in the symbolic order. This is why they are non-all. They don't have any... in this sense, I think that here is how I would try to save Lacanian jouissance and the real for philosophy. And you already indicate that path. I think that what I don't like is this anti-philosophical notion of jouissance as some terrifying excess, too strong for symbolization. But I am tempted to read Lacan's famous formula, which you also quote on, that the real is only accessible through the deadlock, l'impasse of the symbolization, in a very strong literal way. the real is not some in itself, and Lacan formally opposes the idea that the real is any kind of Kantian in itself, which then we can only partially grasp. No, I think that the real literally is nothing but the deadlock of symbolization. A totally immanent real, a real which is just, yes, I stop, cuts of symbolism, and so on and so on. So from here, I would just like to mark maybe one or two, this is a question to you, how you would react differences. One big difference, I'm even not sure about it myself, we have this debate for 15 years, I think, is that in your logics of the worlds, I will just state the position. You seem to imply that what you call world, I think, I know I violently disagree with you and you with me here. I think there is no world without language, to cut a long story short. And I think that the very categories you use, like the crucial category of the point is a signifying category. I agree with you with language is not, here I'm also a Platonist, not a limit. But I claim that, again, the category of world is thinkable only within the human universe of language. While you, if I got you correctly, for you, there are worlds already in, to put it in very naive terms, in reality outside man. Once you even spoke of, ironically, I know, of your dialectic of nature. Second point, you are usually reproached with a very stupid criticism that you are secretly an idealist in the sense of human animal, but then out of nowhere, event, grace, blah, blah. And then the idea is we should nonetheless develop out of concrete history how the event can emerge. I'm tempted to say the opposite, that my critique, open question to you, would have been the opposite one. What I problematize is not event, but human animal. I don't think there is something like human animal. I think that, of course, there is empirically, but okay, to cut a long story short, I just will, and then I will finish, designate my position now. I claim that what you call animal life, this pursuit of servicing the good, service the bien, and so on, this normal animal utilitarian existence, and the truth event, that this polarity, duality, doesn't cover the entire field. There is something which I am tempted to call, with terms like anxiety, death drive, and so on, which is neither the one nor the other. And I think that with humans, what you call animal life, this ordinary existence, utilitarian and so on, servicing the goods, always comes secondary in the sense of its attempt to stabilize some traumatic anxiety, which is also a condition for truth event. You need anxiety, displacement, and so on in order to open up the space for the truth. And I think, that's my final point, that this maybe can be read in a not anti-philosophical way. My whole wager is that all this topic of death drive and so on should be totally de-imaginarized. It's what was called in philosophy, in German idealism, self-relating negativity, and so on. So again, I totally accept your tension between truth, the domain of truth procedures, and human animal. I just think that we need a third domain, death drive, anxiety, and so on, which then allows us to properly locate these two. But I know I didn't prove anything here. But you see my desperate wager, totally agreeing with your anti-anti philosophy. What I'm trying to do is consciously reading Lacan against himself. Because let's be clear, what Jacques-Alain Miller is doing now with his right liberal re-inscription of Lacan as some kind of a liberal wise man and so on, this is the danger of this, what you said, dismissing the truth. That then you definitely, okay, just to finish, because the first thing one should say is that where I disagree with Miller, I hope we agree, is this idea of looking in the last Lacan for some point of last wisdom, you know, like just before he died, he saw something. Which is why, maybe you know it better than me, Lacan's last official mistress, Catherine Millot, I think, yeah, was the object of such affection. The idea was that she was there when Lacan was dying, and that just on the point of dying, he told her something, you know. This last, as you would say, singularity encounter of the real. No, I claim, agreeing with you, that I claim that somewhere between, in those 10 years or more seminars of from anxiety to maybe encore, this was Lacan at his top. And I think, frankly, all those attempts with notes the last years, sorry to tell you, I'm more and more convinced they are gradual disintegration. I don't think, and you effectively have what you said, all this, you know, accommodate to the symptom, truth doesn't matter, a kind of almost, Miller is right, Rortian playfulness, which to us as old, I wouldn't say old followers of the follower of Lenin, not to name the name, no, this I don't buy. So I'm sorry if I was too long, but you see my point. What I'm trying to do is desperately to nonetheless save Lacan in some sense for philosophy. I'm very sorry if I was too long, and please strike back with all your force. Thank you. You need it here or you go there? You can do it here.
Naturally, it's very difficult to say anything after that, because if I go all on the ways you open, we are here tomorrow.
Why not? That's the problem.
Just some short points. First, when you say that the origin of anti-philosophy can be found in Kant and after, there is a danger, I think, because we can identify in this sort of vision anti-philosophy and critical philosophy, transcendental critique. Or in my conviction, it's not the same feeling, it's not the same subject, the same. And why? Because the question of the anti-philosopher is not the question of the limits of reason, of the limits of rational thinking and so on, which is the central question of Kant. It's more radical. It's the idea that there exists in our experience a sort of distance without measure. It's an ontological affirmation, in fact, which is at the very origin of anti-philosophy. There is somewhere a distance that we must support, and which is a distance without measure. Very often, it's the distance between finite and infinite, or something like that, or between man and God. Many great philosophers are in a religious context. We have to remark this point. It's the case of Pascal, it's the case of Rousseau, It's the case of Kierkegaard, and alors, precisely, it's the case of Wittgenstein. It's very important to note that Wittgenstein has finally a mystical vision of the problem of the distance. And the case of Lacan is evidently more complex, but we have the question of the real status of the big other in Lacan. We cannot escape this question. And there is many purely religious interpretation of Lacan that exist, absolutely. There is no frontal contradiction, there is no big contradiction between Lacan and most of the Christian interpretation of psychoanalysis and so on. And all that to say that the first question for anti-philosophy is that there is, in our experience, a distance without measure, and that to produce something concerning this distance, we cannot use conceptual means, purely conceptual.
Isn't this practical reason in Kant?
Absolutely.
Practical reason is in absolute distance from knowledge.
Yes, but in the case of anti-philosophy, we must do the thing and not only show the thing. That is the difference. There is something which is inside philosophy in Kant, because practical reason is the theory of the categoric imperative. It's not a decision of Kant himself.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
It's very important. In anti-philosophy, we have the necessity of a testimony of the anti-philosopher himself as a singularity. It's a practical decision, and the transmission of the experience of the distance without measure is a personal transmission. It's a personal transmission. And it's the case for Pascal, the memorial, the faith, the testimony of the faith. It's naturally the case for Rousseau, which invents the pure autobiography, the pure confession, and Saint Augustine before. And it's also the case for Wittgenstein and others. This is my first remark. So I think we must distinguish four types. Philosopher, which is the conviction that there is a possible connection between truth and the real. The philosophers don't say that this connection is of philosophical nature. Maybe, but maybe not. It's not my conviction, for example. There is for me, there is a connection, a touch of the real in some form of truths, which are artistic, scientific, and so on. But the philosopher has the conviction that there exists some touch of the real under the name of truth. There is the sophist, which is another type. The sophist is the conviction that there is nothing like truth, and maybe nothing that knowledge. The sophist has the conviction that what exists is rhetoric, and finally, some sort of a sort of war in the language, where the stronger is the better. And so the question of the sophist is a question of truth, but in a completely negative way, which is not the sceptic way. Because the sceptic way is a philosophical conviction that we don't know the truth. It's not the conviction that there is no truth at all. So the sceptic, which has the conviction that there is truth, but we cannot know the truth, is inside philosophy. The sophist is not, because his conviction is that there is nothing. Truth is a completely empty word, that there is nothing like that. And that is, there is no interest in truth. But there is, finally, what exists is the language, exclusively. That is the sophist. The philosopher, sophist. Third type, the critic. I name it the critic. It is not exactly a philosopher, because the conviction of the critic is that we cannot really know the truth. And it's a figure of, I agree with you, it's a figure of the two last centuries, which begin at the 19th century, and which is also the vision of the deconstruction and so on, and which is also the idea of an historical end of philosophy as such, metaphysics and so on. And generally, the critic writes some essays. There is no big book, construction, systems, and so on. And finally, there is the anti-philosopher, which is different from the three others. And anti-philosopher is something which pays the price of its proper life, his or her proper life, as the testimony for the distance, for the distance without measure. And it is why, when we have an anti-philosopher, we have a narrative concerning his life inside the text. For example, the relationship of Kierkegaard with a woman is a constitutive part of the development of the thinking of Kierkegaard. And it's really the singularity of one existence, which is finally the support of the vision of the anti-philosopher. And it's the same thing for, clearly for Rousseau, naturally, and sometimes it is the same thing for Lacan. When Lacan is saying, alone as I always was, I declare the foundation of a new school, etc., it's really an existential gesture which is pronounced out as such. And there is short but numerous and very important passages of Lacan which are of personal declarations. So, 4 types. It is my first remark, which is not at all a contradiction with my favorite hysteric. And so it's the first one. The second remark, the short remark, is concerning Lacan. I agree with you, finally, there is a fundamental ambiguity. It's true. It's true. And there is a way in direction of something like classical rationalism, knowledge, matheme, and progressively, in fact, disparition of the subject in the sense of the subject in the first part of it's something else. It's something else, and the substitution of the question of jouissance to the question of desire is very important. And finally, there is an ambiguity because all this way can be said anti-philosophic nature, but can be said also of philosophic nature. Absolutely, I agree with you on this point. And but with complement that if the way of Lacan is finally of philosophic nature, it's in a way which is much more, in my opinion, of classical philosophical nature than Hegelian philosophical nature. Something like that. Much more Descartes or Plato or Aristotle than Hegel. And we can note that Hegel was very important in the first part of the work of Lacan. There was a constant discussion with Hegel at the beginning of Lacan and not at the end. My second advice. And to finish, you know, I think that the simple conviction that there is somewhere a distance without measure is not by itself sufficient to give a definition of the anti-philosopher, because we must add this distance cannot be proved or experimented inside a conceptual framework. This is the second part. And it is why when somebody says that I am an anti-philosopher because, in a certain sense, I admit that there exists a distance without measure, which is finally the distance between individuals and subject. So an immanent distance between individual and subject, which is without measure. Why? Because to become the subject he or her is able of, the individual must be transformed by something which is not reducible to him or her, and the name of which is event. An event is really something which creates a new possibility, and this new possibility is the possibility for the individual to become a subject. All this machinery is a machinery which implies that there exists something like a distance without measure. But it's not true that this distance without measure implies by obligation that no conceptual means have been able to think this distance. And so I am not an anti-philosopher in some sense, but a philosopher of the distance itself. A philosopher of the distance itself. And so the philosopher which is very near the anti-philosopher, because he says, as the philosopher, that there exists that sort of distance which in the common world is without measure between individual and subject, which is also the distance without measure, for example, between democracy and communism.
Listen, I hope, sorry. I propose that I will literally just reply in 20 seconds because I think it's the time to pretend that we are in democracy and so on. Yeah. I first, just to literally two remarks. First, I deeply agree with you, this wonderful formula, yes, absolute distance, but within philosophy. Mm. You, my friend, provided the best definition of what Hegel wants here. You know, like, okay, this is Hegel for me. Second point, you know, it's nonetheless more, I see your wonderful point about the difference between Kantian criticism and anti-philosophy. Mm-hmm. But you know, there is a path from Kant. For example, when you say personal, but already Fichte makes that step, you know, when he says what philosophy you choose depends on what type of a man you are. Mm-hmm. There he is the first to directly refer to a non-conceptual person. Mm-hmm. So, as it may surprise you, but as I promised, I stop now. I know it's strange, but I stop. Merci beaucoup. C'est très belle formule, ça. Distance, mais comme philosophe.
All right, I think we're open for some questions from the floor.
Did you do a good communist job to undermine bourgeois democracy. You wrote them and distributed the question in advance. Okay. I knew you would. Somehow I knew it would be you. Do you need maybe? Yes, you do. For the working classes back there.
Absolutely, and for the lumpen proletariat.
Now, this is an attempt to get the two of you to talk about the differences that are fundamental to your two approaches to ontology. Despite there being a certain amount of overlap, nonetheless, I think there are some important discrepancies that would warrant discussion here. And what's interesting is Lacan in the 19th seminar, 1971 to 1972, just before he went downhill, according to you, Slavoj, he, in one of those sessions, is talking about two of his, for lack of a better word, what we could call axioms that are linked to one another. The first, le grand autre n'existe pas, the big other does not exist. And then, yeah, there is the one. And when he's talking about these, he makes a remark, just a passing aside, where he says, somebody someday is going to make an ontology out of what I am talking about right now. And arguably, both of you seem to be philosophers, or, for instance, Bruno Bostiels calls you an anti-philosopher slightly, but both of you are philosophers who clearly your projects in certain ways involve developing this. Now, how do each of you see yourselves in terms of being able to, say, pass through Lacan's maybe anti-philosophy, but it's a bit ambiguous, passing through Lacan and developing an ontology? What do you see as the crucial differences between the two of you in terms of how, with those sorts of remarks Lacan is making when he predicts that someone is going to base an ontology off of this, how do you feel that the two of you fundamentally differ, apropos your, you might say, philosophical development or deployment of these resources of Lacanianism?
Non, je te passe la parole.
Non, pas assez. J'ai pas compris la fin de la question. Tu me résumes la question?
Lacan dit que quelqu'un dans le futur va développer une ontologie de ce que je dis.
Oui.
Donc, est-ce que c'est nous deux qui le font et quelle est la différence entre nous?
Oui,
c'est une question de s'aimer la différence dans la force du peuple, ce qu'il essaie de faire.
Yes, you know, the question of the relationship between Lacan and ontology is a very obscure question, in fact, not simple. The book of François Balmès is a book concerning, in fact, the question of the relationship between Lacan and the question of being entirely. And he finds many, many suggestions in the text of Lacan, contradictories and so on. I think that a very important point, I think, in Lacan himself is the question of the forms of negativity. What is finally the theory of Lacan concerning nothingness? It's probably more important than to be immediately in face of the question of the conviction of Lacan concerning being, the affirmative ontology of Lacan. But there is many passages which concern the forms of negativity. First, the lack, but in some sense the access to the rest, and so on, all that. And I think that it is the reason for which I affirm that all contemporary philosophers must be in discussion with Lacan. Not because Lacan is properly or exactly a philosopher, but because the question of what is a possible ontology today is transformed by Lacan, by the work of Lacan. And so my answer is yes. I think that the common point, one of the common points between Slavoj and me, is the fact that for us the learning of Lacan, the lesson of Lacan, is of fundamental importance. We can disagree and so on the details, but and it's not so true in the contemporary context, because many philosophers in the contemporary context are explicitly against Lacan. Deleuze first, but many others. And it's the first point. In fact, there is we have two common points, and even if I am the master and Slavoj the hysterical type, it's not completely true, maybe.
Now you sound a little bit hysterical.
Well, yeah. But I recognize that you have the seduction of the hysterical. No, but we have I think three points. First, the conviction that philosophy exists, but it's not the common idea today. The conviction that the philosophy exists, and a variation concerning this point is that we have the conviction that Hegel is alive, is not dead. We are not the same Hegel, maybe, but yeah, we can see that in the text. Hegel is of great importance for us. It's the first point. Philosophy exists, and as a consequence, Hegel exists. Second point, the question of revolution, communism, and so on is not dead. So we don't affirm the death of the sequence of the two last centuries. We know problems, difficulties in passes, and so on. But our subjective conviction is that there is here something to continue. Something to continue, maybe in the dark, but to continue. To continue in the dark is not the same thing that to stop. The second point. No, I finish. Sorry. Not between the second and the third point. and the third point is precisely, I think, that we think that. There is an ontological or metaphysical or philosophical question which must be recognized and developed after Lacan in the philosophical field. These 3 points are of very, very important, and it is why we are here today.
I totally agree with you. I would just like to supplement it that maybe there is another. First, I would like to emphasize this final point. We both share the conviction that hopefully the era of so-called discourse analysis, where every fundamental ontological, even metaphysical question can be reduced to the question of historical discursive conditions. For example, for a typical Foucauldian, if you tell him, does a man have an immortal soul? He will immediately transform it into the question, under what discursive regime can you even ask this question? No? Simply, in a naive sense, how it touches the real and so on becomes totally irrelevant. The question is, under what discursive regime can you talk about this, and so on and so on. This is one thing we share. Another thing we both absolutely share is that we reject the topic of finitude as the ultimate horizon. We notice, both of us, the strange reversal with regard to 19th century, where usually infinity was the spiritual infinity idealism, finitude was concrete being materialism. Today, it's almost the opposite obscurantism and spiritualism today are supported by the topic of finitude. It's by saying, no, we are finite, fragile, and so on, that you open up an empty space where all the ghosts of spiritualism can dwell, and so on and so on. So that would be another feature. But to answer you directly, yes, the question is, because, you know, Lacan, of course, and this is the Lacan that I really hate, I'm ready to admit. The Lacan that I detect in what you quoted, it's the most arrogant Lacan. It's like, I'm unique and great, but there will be in the future ordinary men who will try to drag me back into... That's where I violently disagree with Lacan. I think the true greatness is to accept it. And, you know, I remain here purely a philosopher, radically, in the sense of, you know, whenever somebody says, I leave behind ontology and so on, if you read him closely, you discover traces of a non-reflected, usually very bad ontology. So what I would say, the fundamental category I'm struggling with here is this idea, which unfortunately was elaborated even in some Gnostic tradition. Of course, I don't want to do that. This idea of unfinished reality, in the sense of, in this sense, we should abandon ontology only in the sense if by ontology we think of pure, positively constituted reality. And I think the way I read also your point about original multiplicity, it's precisely as you emphasize, it's not a multiplicity composed of ones. It's a multiplicity which is a radical multiplicity. You cannot come to the end and they say, then say, so this idea of and here I follow even Meillassoux, although again, then immediately I take a different path. This idea of how what we misperceive as the limitation of our knowledge, not limitation in the sense of finitude, but incompleteness, should be immediately ontologized into incompleteness of reality itself. This is how I would have read. I try to do it now in a materialist way, outside all the bullshit about how our mind creates reality, the lesson of quantum physics. This terrible lesson that really, in itself, things are not fully constituted. In this sense, I am against the ontology, this full positive ontology, which I find, in spite of all my admiration for Lenin, for example, in Lenin's materialism and empirical-criticism, where the problem becomes, you know, are there really things outside there fully existing? And this asymptotic, I think what we share is total opposition to this asymptotic notion of truth. There is full reality out there. We gradually but never perfectly approach it. Where? No wonder you know who admired deeply materialism and empiriocriticism. A ferocious anti-communist, if there ever was one, Karl Popper. You notice that. In spite of all his criticism, he said, but material empiriocriticism, Lenin is excellent there. No, I claim he is not. But nonetheless, to play the bad guy, I totally agree with you that the problem is with these different forms of negativity. Now, playing a bad guy, maybe here there is some difference between the two of us. Where you say multiplicity and void, I would try to read maybe more of some kind of negativity, which I take from Hegel into this void. Because I know you don't mean it in this way, but, you know, my primordial fear is that, I'm not saying you do, but some people do, namely, is to reading this multiplicity and void into a kind of Orientalist Buddhist position, you know, multiplicity of phenomena against the background of void as a kind of a zero primordial abyss and so on. That's not the void which is my void. My void is more of an obstacle, failure, catastrophe. It's a more violent, dynamic void. But we don't. But these are absolutely fundamental questions. We cannot do it now.
Unless Alain wants to respond.
No, no.
Oh, yeah, you have it there. Go.
I want to ask a further question about the link between ontology and freedom, which in this case, in the context of talking about Lacan's anti-philosophy, we could link to the act. Now, Alain, in your work, for instance, in your seminar on the anti-philosophy of Lacan from the mid-90s, you talk about the act and how Lacan treats it as quite central to marking him out as an anti-philosopher. But here, Slavoj had his own way of bringing you into proximity of anti-philosophy. I think on this issue, it's possible to do so by pointing out that where one would least expect it, that is, at the very start of being an event, your magnum opus, that there is this sort of what one could call an act as this radical decision, where confronted with the Platonic Parmenidean question, being one or many, which one could say for you, in the terms of logics of worlds, is a point that any and every philosopher must confront, where there's a yes or no choice to be made, and one has to commit. You wager, in the form of the axiom, the one is not. But that is a decision which, as you indicate there, cannot be grounded by appeal to some sort of guiding intuitions or some meta level vouching for the choice one way or the other. And this might be Sartre's shadow still in the background in terms of him as one of your three masters in 20th century French thought. It seems as though it's that justifies choosing the one particular branch of pure mathematics that you choose. You know, what justifies the Mello-Frankel plus the axiom of choice amongst other axiomatizations of set theory, and what even, you know, makes set theory privileged versus other branches of mathematics. It seems as though it's that ZFC is the only mathematical discourse that is truly oneless, or that tries to formalize an ontology without ones. So it seems as though the choice comes first, the decision, the pure decision, the act of wagering on the many in the form of the one is not versus the one, that even gets your own ontology off the ground. And given that for you, ontology, you know, although it's mathematical, this is very much the concern of philosophy as a kind of meta-ontology. It would seem as though you're once again back in proximity with anti-philosophy in terms of there being this radical, ungrounded gesture, this decision in the face of a kind of ontological point, that's your act that literally sets up the very architecture of being an event. And I'm wondering how you and then maybe
À peu près, oui, tu me le redis quand même.
Non, non, quand même, l'idée c'est que au début de l'être événement,
Oui.
comme tu fais choix d'une certaine ontologie,
Oui,
d'une certaine logique des ensembles, etc., est-ce que c'est pas quand même, comme dans l'anti-philosophie, ton choix fondamental, existentiel, acte de liberté?
The point is to return to my goal in philosophy. Yeah, why philosophy is for me something interesting. Finally, there is always something like that in every biography of a philosopher. And for me, the question of philosophy is the question of novelty, of creation, of how something new is possible in the world. Something which is not reducible to the repetition. In fact, I name repetition all the structures of the world as it is, all the inertia of the world. Okay. So, is there something which interrupts repetition? And what are the general conditions of that sort of interruption? And naturally, behind all that, we have the condition of the creation of a new trend in artistic creation, political revolution, love encounter, and so on, a new theory. All that are the concrete forms of novelty. So, you know, my problem is not the existence of something new, because for me it's a fact. There has been and there exists something new. There exists a great love, patience, artistic creations, scientific theory, and political revolutions. So my question is not the existence of novelty, but how something like that is possible, and how we can have a thinking of novelty. So it's a properly philosophical question, which comes, like Hegel says, after the truth. The truth exists, and the philosophical question comes in the evening, in the evening of the day of truth. So I accept this judgment. And to answer this question, how something new is possible, how we are not under the laws of repetition, we are not absolutely under the laws of repetition, I must propose an ontological framework. Because without an ontological framework, we cannot understand what is new, precisely. What is new, we must construct an ontology of repetition, precisely, of the universe of being as it is. And my decision concerning this ontology is not of the decision to take mathematics. The decision was that an ontology which is not a theological ontology, which is not under the potency of the one. That is my question. What is an ontology which is not under the potency of the one? I agree with Heidegger on this point, in a text which you can find in the big book concerning Nietzsche. That is, Heidegger says that finally we can define metaphysics by the potency of the one. So it's not only forgetting being and so on, it's more precise. The organization of the potency of the one, that is metaphysics. Okay. So if I love weakness and not potency, like Lacan said, I have to love multiplicity and not the one, and not the big potency of the one. So I propose an ontology of the pure multiplicities. And if we have an ontology of the pure multiplicities, the difficulty is that we have without one. So multiplicity of what? Not of elements. Multiplicity of multiplicities, like Slavoj. And it's at this point that I search in the direction of mathematics. Only at these points, when my conviction is that contemporary ontology is by necessity an ontology of multiplicities. It's not mine only, it's also the conviction of Deleuze and many others, against the potency of the one, and radically, that is, multiplicity is multiplicities of multiplicities. And so there is no stopping point in the analysis of multiplicity. If something stops, we are in the void. There is nothing at all. Because if there is something, something is a multiplicity. So the connection between multiplicity and the void is not a duality, a metaphysical duality, Void is the immanent nothingness which is inside the multiplicity as the multiplicity of multiplicities. Okay? So that is my choice. And after that, in this framework, we have to understand the possibility of something new, and so it's the theory of an event and so on. We cannot explain all that today. The point, the very important point, is that the element of pure decision, the personal element, has been the conviction that in the contemporary situation, the context to examine the possibility of something new is an ontology of multiplicities, of pure multiplicities, that is multiplicity without one. This point is very, very, very important. Biographically, naturally, one says that why is the question of novelty? It was certainly first by political education at the light of May '68, so something uprising like very condition of true life. So the conviction that a true life cannot be a life inside repetition. But it's a very general biographical point, I think. I think it is really many subjects, the conviction of whom is that true life is repetition. It's a point of view of the state. It's a point of view of the order itself. The power loves repetition. But a thinking which cannot be ordered by the power is by necessity a thinking of disrupting the repetition itself.
Can I just now to return to his question, because so would you agree with him? His, if I got you correctly, point was the following one. So now, sorry if I speak as a police interrogator. So now you admitted that you had first some kind of existential decision how to think something new and so on, and based on that you violently picked out one mathematical theory among others. The reasons were not to be naive, you look around which theory is better or whatever, you simply picked out of the multiplicity of mathematical theories the one which fits this. His reproach, if I got it correctly, is, aren't you here close to some kind of anti-philosophical gesture? And if I may just, and then I give it to you, very brief remark, really brief. You know where maybe there is a difference between us? There is no one. We agree here. But for me, this is not just a fact there is no one, but this is a positive obstacle. The one always fails. The failure of one, which gives us two, but not the two of this Oriental bullshit, yin-yang imbalance. So my problem would be, I put it in very abstract terms, I would like to have in your multiplicity already some form of the two. Two is crucial. I agree here with you often emphasize. I stop here.
Well, it's a technical question. Maybe it's a too technical question.
Oh, okay.
Precisely, the form of the two in the pure multiplicity is a distinction between element and party, element and subset.
Yeah.
And the distinction between how a subset in the set and how an element in the set inscribes in the multiplicity itself a fundamental duality. And the development of this duality is of capital importance in being an event, naturally, because finally it's also the question of the state, the question of the excess, and also the question of what is a generic set. That is the ontological form of a truth. But yes, I agree with the question. Naturally, when I am in the question, how can I think a multiplicity which is a multiplicity of multiplicities, and if I do a choice in different possibilities in set theory, my choice will be Zermelo-Fraenkel theory of sets, and not a theory of sets with atoms, which exists too. So there exists some theory of sets where elements are atoms, so with one inside the multiplicity. So I take a theory of sets without atoms, without one. And so after that, we have that sort of dialectics, singular dialectics between multiplicity and the void, and not between multiplicity and the one. That is certainly a technical choice because, in fact, it is possible to construct a theory of sets in the mathematical field with atoms. Because it's not the choice of Democritus or Epicurus. It's not multiplicity of atoms and the void. That is very important. It's in immanent dialectics of multiplicity and the void by the mediation of the fact that multiplicity is always multiplicity of multiplicities. But in the classical atomistic materialism, it's not the case. Because in atomistic materialism, multiplicity is multiplicity of ones, atoms. And the void is a general context in which we have atoms, precisely. So it's not that sort of atomistic materialism, it's something else, but naturally it's a choice. But it's a choice which is, I think, not really biographical, existential, or a tragic choice, like the question for Kierkegaard of marriage. It's not exactly like the question of Kierkegaard of marriage with Regine. It's a more quiet question and more technical. It is why I don't think that it is really a trace of anti-philosophy.
I think we really are getting a little bit late. How are you guys doing? You want any more questions? Or?
There are two hands being raised there. Maybe we can.
Alors the two.
The two.
Come up and take a microphone.
No, I don't need a microphone.
But the rest of the people need it.
Oh, cannot hear me? No.
Yeah.
Following your remarks, do you really think that class struggle must continue in the dark? I understand class struggle as real, and the Bartleby politics that Mr. Žižek refers to, I prefer not to. But is there not some way to teach the act? I mean, maybe not in a university setting or as discourse, but in the Mojave Desert now we run workshops called The New Everyday Life, where we teach leatherworking and biodiesel mechanics and beer making and things like this. Does this fall into neo-anarchism, like Simon Critchley or something? Must we seize the state to have a pure act, or can we teach the act on a smaller scale?
No, first, I was accused, among others, by our good friend Peter Holward, who said that I'm inconsistent. Sometimes I say, do nothing, wait. Sometimes I wait for some big suicidal act. Sometimes I propose pragmatic measures. Can't I decide? Well, I find this reproach totally nonsensical. It's like reproaching me, yesterday you ate a hamburger, today a pizza, can't you decide? No, fuck you, why should I decide? I mean, there are I'm very precise here. There are situations where, and I quote you, that when doing something just contributes, even if it's critical to reproduction of the existing, where the most violent thing, as I repeat, is to do nothing. There are obvious situations where a great collective act is needed, and there are situations totally honorable, why not, when small patient work is needed. So my first reply here is quite an opportunistic one, not opportunistic in the sense of political opportunism, but I think you know, to try to press us on this choice. What do you advocate? Doing nothing, preparing big revolution, or patient everyday work? Why impose a choice here? It's a strategic question. Now, you mentioned a certain obscene name that I prefer not to enter, Critchley and so on. No. My problem with that one is simply that what he describes is for me a way too comfortable position. You know, I don't think you have the right to say there is the state out there, but I want to remain outside. And I mean, it's for me too close to the position of the beautiful soul and so on and so on. I think that we should nonetheless insist, and this is the being faithful to the idea of communism, that nonetheless we should, how to put it, you know, as they say, sub specie aeternitatis, that you observe reality through the lenses of the idea, an eternal idea, that communism should be the idea through which we judge what is going on today. And that's my basic. Here then I leave you all the opportunism, in a good sense, opportunism. Improvise, teach in the deserts, here, there. Don't underestimate, nonetheless, universities. I think that what you suffer here now, with all this financial crisis, in Europe, even worse, so-called Bologna reform, more and more, you know, universities are becoming a bastion of something which threatens the predominant form of domination, which is why more and more they try to streamline, to make universities, as they put it, you know, it's very popular in Europe to say today, universities shouldn't be an ivory towers of knowledge which is of no use to anyone. They should serve concrete needs of the, you know, this to, so don't be ashamed of university knowledge. It's getting more and more precious, and I claim we need it more than ever today. University knowledge to know what is going on. I don't believe in this, oh, why don't only teach, study, do something, but how do you know the truth precisely of what you are doing? It's more and more needed. We need theory more than ever. I don't believe this would be for me anti-philosophy in a bad sense. To think that in order to decide of a truth of a theory, some kind of direct practical experience tells you. No, in order to decide if there is truth in what you are really doing, you need a theory more than ever. So don't feel guilty. You are here victim of the ruling ideology, I claim. If you feel guilty in the sense of, oh my God, people are starving in Africa and so on, and we are just spending time here philosophizing or whatever. Bill Gates talks like this today. This a whole argumentation of we are spending time here blowing up, spending taxpayers' money while real suffering goes out there. This is the predominant discourse today. This kind of pseudo-emergency state in order to make us feel guilty, because what you find beneath this is all the time this pragmatic call, people are starving in Africa. So stop with your stupid critique of capitalism and so on. Let's do something. Stop thinking too much. Let's all of us get together and, you know, no, more than ever, not only with regard to this, but even, for example, in Europe, you must have read in your newspapers, the Greek crisis. It's very sad. You know, some of our Trotskyite friends are already in their pre-orgasmic state, you see it's almost here, the revolution will happen. No, it is not. What depresses me most is that it's just a protest. But there is, except of some vague calls to solidarity or return to welfare state, first, even what the Greeks want, it's pure reactive politics. They basically want to keep the old privileges. And even here, you know, here even, this is horrible to say, my Greek friends will probably lynch me. But, you know, for example, in Slovenia, you know, it sounds very nice, solidarity with Greece. But wait a minute, in Slovenia, trade unions opposed any help to Greece, with a very rational argumentation, which is also egotistic but interesting. They compared the price, not only the real purchase power, but even, because this is even better for the Greeks, but the average income of a Greek worker, even after all these austerity measures. And they discovered it's still 40% higher, will be, after all these austerity measures, than the income of an average Slovene worker. So they are telling us, we solidarity with Greeks, so now we should give money to Greeks. Okay, what about other East European countries and so on and so on? In other words, now I will say something really horrible for which you will maybe even proclaim to be a secret right-winger or what. I think there is also an element of truth in the fact that Greeks were effectively living off European Union donations and enjoying an extremely high level of protection and so on, which you don't find in other European nations, in the West or in the East. For example, do you know that the average time a Greek worker retires is 53 years of age? Do you know that in many now I sound like right-winger, but my point is not let's take from them. My point is that it's absolutely crucial here, that's my point, to, I put it this way. Some people in Europe, leftists, think that the lesson of this crisis is European Union is bad, it's the organ of international financial capital, and that the solution for the left is strong nation state, like dealing from international. I think it's more than ever necessary to counter international capital with forms also of solidarity, and here we should be international solidarity of the workers and so on and so on. This is absolutely crucial today to avoid this trap of nation state, this withdrawal to nation state, and then you get here an extremely obscene versions which shocked me, like some high-level British leftists, I will not name them, look at the editorial board of New Left Review, seriously flirt with the idea of supporting Václav Klaus, who is now the president of the Czech Republic, pure neoliberal right-winger, and from this right-wing position, as a threat to liberty, he opposes European Union. And they claim, no, the crucial thing of the left today is to oppose European Union and have a stronger nation state. What if Klaus is really one of us and he just pretends to be a neo-market liberal to pass this basic progressive idea of undermining European Union? I think this path is a catastrophe. I think that it's so important to insist that since capital is global, the only way to counter it, it's not nation. If we found resistance at nation-state levels, then this is the ideal field of the capital, which then can play one nation against the other, outsourcing and all those games. Everything will be decided at this level. And here again, we need theory. What they need in Greece is theory. That is so depressing for me if you follow the Greek events. Absolutely. It's just, you know, popular fury. So what I am afraid is that when people will be disappointed by the impotence of leftist demands, you will get the right-wingers. You will get other types of national. And this is the true catastrophe of the European left today, as I like to repeat. How, my God, this old polarity of two main parties which address all the population, center right, center left, and then some fringe parties, is being replaced by another polarity. One big, let's call it liberal capitalist party, usually tolerant, pro-abortion, blah, blah. And then the only opposition, a violent anti-immigrant, openly racist party. It's happening, that's the catastrophe, in Eastern Europe, serially, Romania, Hungary, even in the West, Belgium, Netherlands, and so on and so on. And again, in this situation, again, theory is needed absolutely. So don't fall into this romantic of some kind of a, how should I put it, immediate, authentic action, and so on and so on. It's absolutely crucial today more than ever, I claim, to stick to theory. So don't be ashamed that you are here. You are privileged, but then instead of, in this typical petit bourgeois way, feeling guilty of, oh, people are starving and I'm here spending, use your privilege to learn, to study, and so on, and do something.
Remind the audience about the Middlesex fight going on.
Yeah, another example, yes, Middlesex University, philosophy department cancelled. Here you can see how real are these struggles, my God. Definitely, it's incredible under what target all around Europe is today this so-called useless higher education and so on and so on. So again, if you play this game of who needs useless academic knowledge, you are playing the game of those in power. But okay, let's not lose time.
Yes, in one word. You know, the global situation today, one remark, you observe how we pass from a very precise question, is Lacan an anti-philosopher, to something very different. What is the planetary situation today? But it's a very interesting logic. The global situation today is a situation very near the situation in the middle of the 19th century. There is a situation where practically the capitalism is the future for everybody. There is no idea, in the strong sense of the word, of something else. And it was the case during the first part of the 19th century. So the question of action, of what we must do and so on, is a very difficult one. What is the way in the 19th century? We find two different things. First, some revolts, some actions, some process of organizations, which are in the form of multiplicity for the case. There is no unity of all that. There is action of the class of workers in France. There is nationalist action in small countries and so on one side. And on the other side, we have a very important intellectual production. We have Marx and Engels who read Hegel. And there is no contradiction. There is no contradiction. I agree completely with Slavoj on this point. Maybe at another stage of the situation, we can understand what is exactly the unity of all that and to construct a form of unity of all that. For the moment, the situation is that all practical experiments concerning a new possibility in the field of politics are good things. And we have to examine the sense, the orientation, the new invention of all local experimentations. Okay, but on the other side, we have to do strong and new intellectual production to understand and unify the situation. And the most important point is to have a global idea. Without a global idea, the multiplicity is condemned at term to failure. Because we must oppose to the global vision of capitalism at the hand of human history and other vision. It's an obligation. It is in the context of a new idea that we must examine and participate to all forms of revolts, innovation, new form of organization, and so on. That is the situation today. And it is why I agree the fact that philosophy, intellectual discussion, examination of very complex problems are a necessity today, but are a necessity also to fight for the Department of Philosophy of Middlesex, for the new rights of immigrants, and so on. You know, I am also an activist. It's something which is very common in France today. And, but between the local activism concerning, for example, the right of the strangers, the new form of terrible nationalism and so on against all that, and the great consideration concerning the ideas and the status of philosophy today, in my conviction, there is no contradiction at all.
Can we nonetheless...
Second question.
You know why? So that at least hypocritically we can say not only men were speaking, women were also allowed to speak.
The second and last question.
Yeah, please. Yeah, it's there.
Thank you. Versus faith.
Faith, like...
particularly in light of your interest in St. Paul, which I feel like faith is, I'm kind of mapping as outside of the model. Outside of the model, I'm thinking of, I have this quote from Jameson, Jameson from Postmodernism, his cultural logic on the capitalism. He says that insofar as the theorist wins by constructing an increasingly closed and terrifying machine, to that very degree he loses, since the critical capacity of his work is thereby paralyzed, and the impulses of negation, revolt, social transformation, these radical politics that we're working towards, I think, are increasingly perceived as vain and trivial in the face of the model itself. And so that theme, I just don't understand it. I see it as a formalism. You're saying that, you know, this knowledge of the real that is perhaps unknown can be transmitted in this anti-mystical way. An anti-mystical way that I think then resurrects this dichotomy by this reliance on proof. Because all we can do is think the act is the act. Is this not then a ceiling or horizon of the act itself? This anti-mystical then ascribes to this structural mythos, like informalizing another symbology, this mathematical symbology. This evening or dusk of truth, isn't the asymptote itself that we're talking about, this ceiling, that all we can do is think the act? That theory still exists and is important. Where then, in this formalization of the math theme, is this distance without measure? And is there then an exclusion of faith? Is it separated from it? Is math theme really a formalism that denies some kind of unmappable faith?
Là, il faut que tu me dises, je ne comprends rien. Je n'ai pas compris la question.
Elle a posé la question du rapport entre le matin et la foi.
Et faith.
Faith, croyance. Et l'idée, c'est que, où est le lieu pour activité, liberté, si on reste figé sur le matin comme compréhension pure, etc.
Yeah. Oui, the question of the matheme is different from the question of decision. Matheme is only a question of transmission. That is a formalization to transmit to others an act which is without concept and without normal language to transmit it. So matim is only a formalization of something with the goal to transmit all that to others. The question of the decision is different, and the question of decision is really the question of becoming a subject. The name faith in Paul, or what is the content of the name of the word faith? The content is that we accept the event. For Paul, there is nothing else in faith, only to accept the event. The event for Paul is resurrection of the Christ, okay. But faith is acceptation of the event, and so acceptation to participate to the consequences of the event. And if we are in the conviction that all what is new is finally the result of the consequences of an event, we have by necessity this form of subjectivity which can be named a faith. There is no objection to this name. Why not faith? If faith signifies only, first, the acceptation of the existence of the event, which is neither something obvious, and second, the acceptation to participate to the consequences of the event, to become an activist of the event, something like that. And so there is no contradiction between three terms. First, ontology is something of mathematical nature. So being as being is not a question of faith, of miracle, or of human existence. Being qua being is a structure that we can think across a mathematical disposition. First point. Second, there is an event, and acceptation of the event is the first form of subjectivation for the individuals. We can say that faith is the name of subjectivation. And third, the novelty is constructed by the development in the situation of the consequences of the event. And as a result of all that, we have the possibility of becoming a subject in a context which is a context of repetition.
I was deeply impressed by your question because I feel I know what is bothering you. Maybe we should have explained more how matim function. For example, if I ask myself to give if I'm asked to give a clear, simple idea of mathem, I always tell people think about quantum physics. As everybody knows, Richard Feynman repeated this all the time. Nobody can understand quantum physics, and it doesn't mean we all bluff. It means these are certain formulas which work. If by understanding we mean, and this is ultimately what understanding means, translating this formula into our everyday experience of reality, you cannot do it. It resists translation into the universe of meaning. And if you want a political dimension to it, I would have said that maybe, just maybe, capitalism is more and more working in this way as a matim. That is to say, more and more it works as some kind of a global machinery, and that the fact that it cannot be understood is what you said when you proposed a wonderful thesis that capitalism is the first worldless civilization. What all these paranoiac theories, right-wing or leftist cultural theorists, try to do is to reduce capitalism to a certain world of meaning. It's European capitalism, or it's the Jewish plot, or whatever. You want a concrete, what you cannot accept is just that it's a kind of a meaningless formula which works with all civilizations. You can have Catholic capitalism, Protestant, Chinese capitalism, Confucian, very successful today, as we know. And we have to, this would be to touch the real of capitalism, to render visible this irreducible gap between the real and all attempts to provide a meaning to it. Like that's the seduction of Catholic Church today. Basically, they are telling you, we know you experience capitalism as some horrible, meaningful, expanded reproduction. Follow us, and we will allow you, as you put it, to have a cake and eat it. That is to say, you will have capitalism, but if you follow us and don't do it too radically, no stem cell research, not too much, whatever, if you keep it under certain limits, we will enable you nonetheless to live in a meaningful universe, and so on and so on. So this would be a very political, that the first task of the left is to abandon, again, either in the right-wing predominant forum of we should keep our cultural national identity, or in the left-wing forum, this is why I reject all this bullshit about capitalism, Eurocentrism. No, the problem of capitalism today is precisely it's no longer Eurocentric. It truly is a neutral machine. And this is what gives a boost to Western new nationalism. They finally got it that, you know, it can really work in Singapore and China, maybe even better than it works here. So you see, this would be, again, one example of, I think, very nice one of this gap that you mentioned. Not to see capitalism as this real of a certain self-reproducing, again, market mechanism, which for contingent reasons it was born in Europe. But there is no deeper truth in it. It's not that, you know, we learn something deep about capitalism if we reduce it to its contingent historical origins. No, this precisely is not the truth. The truth is that it cut the links, that it's today a universal machine. So this would be, again, for me, if you want, in a very naive way, almost a practical use of this distinction between a world horizon and capitalism as worldless. Which is why I think, and this is an old polemic, I tend to be opposed to what is very popular today everywhere, in China today, in India, in all these places. They almost lynched me because I attacked this idea. They all dream about alternate modernity. Like, you in the West screwed it up, we will do it in our way. But you know what they really want is to have capitalism without paying the price for it, with all the antagonisms and so on. I told the Chinese, I told them, you know, the Chinese, which means out of 1 billion, 6 million to 100 students. Okay, it wasn't that I was talking to the Chinese nation. I told them, you may talk the bullshit about harmonious society, but you will not get harmonious capitalism. And even in India, I discovered, to my horror, to what extent they, in a different way, played the same game as in China. They desperately tried to keep alive their even most reactionary Hindu caste system and so on traditions, to serve as a kind of a screen of meaning to enable you to confront capitalism. And of course, I think that this is a nice example of how even the critique of Western imperialism, cultural imperialism, serves a very obscure role of justifying their own way to legitimize their capitalism. And to cut the long story short, why am I so opposed to so-called alternate modernity? Because, you know, as I always repeat it, in Europe we had one big alternate modernity in the 20th century. It was called fascism. Fascism was precisely alternate modernity. The idea was, fascism, basic idea of fascism is we can have all good that capitalism brings, industrialization and so on, without paying the price for it in social antagonisms. That's why you need anti-Semitism. The idea is it's not in the system, and this is why, now I will say something horrible, I'm even a little bit distrustful about Hugo Chavez and so on. He comes often a little bit too close to it, namely, I don't have any big sympathy for American imperialism, but maybe the time has come to admit that thanks to the great efforts of your greatest president, George Bush, United States is, I mean, he really did a wonderful job. In 8 years, he succeeded in diminishing the role of United States to one in a polycentric world, to one among other local powers, no? But what this means, I will tell you something horrible, but you should like it, is that, you know, it's no longer always absolutely automatically that United States are the bad guy. This also means a polycentric world, like with all my still admiration for China and so on. But you know, what the Chinese are doing in Myanmar, politically correct name for Burma, is also a form of new economic post-colonialism and so on. So, you know, we should try to approach in a different way. I think the danger today is, this is what really worries me, if you ask me, that anti-imperialist rhetorics can function as a tool to obfuscate the basic class struggle. Let me take the brutal example of Zimbabwe and, I hope not, South Africa. I have an extremely simple explanation, only the core explanation. What happened there is the following. I spoke with people in Zimbabwe, I wasn't there, from Zimbabwe, South African friends. What really happened after the end of apartheid in South Africa? It is that the standard of living experience of ordinary people, it's basically the same as under apartheid. Maybe in some tiny circles a little bit better, but at the same time worse, because there is much more uncertainty, crime, and so on. The only thing that really changed is that you have a new black rich class which joined the white class. Now, to counter the disappointment of the ordinary people, the big temptation of and to obfuscate the class struggle, the big temptation of the new black ruling class is to play the race card. Is to claim you are no better because we are really still enslaved to Western imperialism, blah, blah, blah. No, sorry, I disagree here. I claim this is the worst attempt. This is why I tried to give Mugabe a chance. I spoke with my friends there, and they told me, who are leftists, radical, and they told me, no, unfortunately, critique of Mugabe is not just Western media attacking. He did screw it. Zimbabwe is the pure case of this. The new black elite playing the race card in order to avoid precisely the new class confrontation. And if this will be the future, this nationalist regimes and so on, then it's really sad. We really need what you said, confronting capitalism at its own level, outside this particular frames, against this, against that, and so on, and so on. But maybe we talk too much.
No.
Tu veux conclure avec un grand mot? No.
No.
We were, is it 5? We were 3 hours. We are approaching these long Maoist sessions, you know, of self-criticism and so on.
I think I'm around Cuba, right?
Sorry?
In Cuba, go all night.
In Cuba, it's even, but this is why French call me Fidel, you know, like, I talk too much, but in Cuba, no, it's better there. When I was there, Fidel gave a speech which lasted 2 hours, and everybody was in a panic, like, is he dying or what, you know? Usually it's 6, 7 hours. No?
I want to remind you all that Slavoj and Alain and Frederick Jameson and a whole roster of other wonderful speakers will be at our Wagner conference on June 1st and 2nd at the Hammer Museum. And please join us, come early. And once again, let's thank them for the great discussion.
Salut mon cher.
No, but,